Okay, I was given I was told that this is to be a talk about the war in Iraq and the U.S. economy. And in trying to figure out what I should talk about, I discovered that I had little ambiguity about the meaning of the word "and." So I've written a lot, obviously primary focus in the New York Times, and the primary focus in the new book is on the economy. The bigger point, and the point that has really brought me into even more controversial territory than I was before, is that there is a tremendous affinity between the story of how we went to war in Iraq and the story of what's happened afterwards, actually, and the story of economic policy. Both are, in some way you might say that I was sensitized to what might be going on, and quicker on the uptake to realize how things were transpiring, because I had identified a modus operandi on the part of the administration by looking at economic policy that turns out to be a carryover turns out to be equally well reflected in the war in Iraq. In fact, in the introduction to my new book, I do talk about the eerie parallels, or not so eerie, once you understand what's going on, the strong parallels between the way those two policies were formulated, the way they were sold, and now it's also becoming clear that there's a lot of similarity in the aftermath. So let me talk about that. Let me talk about policy making, politics, the economy, the war in Iraq, and then let me talk about how the war in Iraq and domestic economic policy collide a bit later on. Okay, so I began writing for the Times in January of 2000 and had been hired. We shook hands on the deal in the summer of 1999, and it was the NASDAQ was still climbing, the economy was booming. We thought I'd be writing overwhelmingly about economics and business. I'd be writing about happy stuff, mostly, maybe silly stuff, and I certainly would be talking about economic crises and irresponsible governments, but elsewhere, right? Because the United States would always have sensible policies and really stuff like crony capitalism and irresponsible budgets and banana republic politics happened in other countries, never in our own. Didn't turn out that way, and I've ended up writing more and more. And if you follow the arc of what I've written, it moved from puzzlement to bemusement, and then gradually over to outrage, because this is really very, very upsetting stuff. There are some people who will tell me that I'm overreacting, or that I was naive, that, well, surely we all know that all governments fudge the truth a little bit, and that policy is always colored by political concerns, and that special interests always get a bigger share of the government's attention than the ordinary average citizen. But I think that seeming sophistication of that kind of put down is actually naive. We're not looking at just the ordinary human fallibility of government in the United States. We're talking about something that is different in degree to such an extent that it's really different in kind. What I first began to notice actually during the 2000 campaign, and even more so after, was that we were dealing with a new crop of politicians who didn't just do the usual pretending that their policies were better or likely to yield bigger results than you could realistically say, but who would actually just claim that a policy was doing the opposite of what it was actually doing. That I wasn't allowed during the 2000 campaign, about the only censorship the Times has ever imposed on me. I wasn't allowed to use the word lie. But there was a lot of lying going on even then, and even more so now. That, yes, there's always some political tilting of decisions. But the striking thing, and I'll come back to that at some greater length in a few minutes, is that these days everything is political. Some of you may have read the Esquire interview with John DiIulio, who was heading faith-based programs, who issued who said that he was shocked that in this White House there was never a substantive discussion of a policy issue. It was always about the political, how things played politically, and talked about the reign of the Mayberry Machiavellis. The next day he tried to retract, but there is no evidence that Karl Rove put a horse's head in his bed. But Ron Suskind, the reporter, did have it documented that he did in fact say those things. And that's been the most striking thing. There's been very little effort to govern as opposed to take political advantage. Crises, difficulties, problems are not there to be solved but to be used. And that was something that was really striking and very different. And of course you always have special interests playing a role. If you want, you can talk about how the Clinton administration used up a significant amount of our diplomatic capital on behalf of Chiquita Banana. These things do happen. But at this point, it's not simply that K Street has a lot of access. The K Street and Pennsylvania Avenue have merged. The lobbyists are inside the government. People even receiving, even still on the paycheck inside the government. So it's really something quite different. So we are in a new world, and it's been my misfortune to find myself in a place where I feel I have no choice but to write about that and try and describe what's really happening on the op-ed page of the New York Times. Let me then talk about what I saw during the selling of the tax cuts, which are, after all, the signature policy of the Bush administration other than the Iraq War, although the same thing, the same pattern can be seen on other policies. The first thing that one noticed about the tax cut proposals was that the ostensible reason kept on shifting, an ever-changing rationale. So we have the original 2001 tax cut was in fact proposed in late 1999. And there's no mystery about what purpose it was intended to serve. It was a big signal to the right wing of the Republican Party that Bush was their guy. It was designed to ward off Steve Forbes in the primaries. And it was devised in 1999 with that purpose in the context of a booming economy with a large budget surplus. And during the during the campaign selling of the tax cut, it was sold as, well, this is we have this big budget surplus, it should be returned to the people, where the people, well, they kept on saying it was working in middle class and poorer Americans, but if you actually looked at the numbers, the people, turns out to 42% of it went to people in the top 1%. But still, it was to return, the tax cut was justified by these budget surpluses, which were excessive. Then along came 2001, and the tax cut was suddenly the perfect answer to a slowdown in the economy. So we had a tax cut that was designed for economic stimulus, even though you knew that it had been designed at a time when the recession was on nobody's horizon, and didn't look remotely like a policy designed for economic stimulus, but nonetheless the rationale shifted. And then, when it turned out that neither the budget surplus nor the stimulative economic effects that were used to rationalize the tax cut were working, it became for something completely different. Oh, it's all about long-run growth and improving incentives by eliminating double taxation and all of that. And so we had a constantly shifting rationale for a policy that was invariant. Clear sign that you had, whatever the agenda was, it wasn't what they were saying publicly. The second thing that one noticed about the selling of the tax cut was that it was sold under false pretenses. That's what I wasn't allowed to say in 2000, but there were simply flat statements. Most of the tax cut will go to the middle income and lower income Americans. So said the candidate in 2000 over and over again. And yet, this is not a matter of opinion. You can go and use the Treasury tax model to evaluate these things. Now, the Treasury is under instructions by no means ever to do that these days, but essentially the copies of the Treasury tax model are in the hands of other people. A couple of think tanks in Washington have it, and they've run it, and you always come up with the answer that the 2001 tax cut was delivering the great bulk of its benefits to the top few percent of the population, and again, 40+% to people making more than $300,000 a year. So this was a simple, flat misrepresentation of what the tax cut was doing. There were many other misrepresentations, the budget surplus projections that were used to claim that what the thing was affordable were fundamentally dishonest as well. And so we have this, something which I think is unique. We've always had administrations that shade the truth a bit. But to actually claim that your policy is utterly different from what it is, just look at the actual content of the policy, that was new. The last thing, I guess, to say is that there has, in tax policy, been a repeated element of bait and switch. You're told one thing, and then afterwards, it's said, oh, well, actually, the story is quite different from that. So we had a big budget surplus, and right up to the passage of the 2001 tax cut in June of 2001, the administration kept on insisting, well, there's plenty of money. This fits easily within the budget. The next month, we were suddenly told that revenues were plunging, and the budget was in big trouble. Is it conceivable that Treasury officials hadn't been warning them while the tax cut was being pushed, that revenue from capital gains and profits taxes were falling off a cliff? No, of course, they knew that. They just managed to keep us from finding out until the thing was in law. Just jumping ahead a little bit on my story, if we ask about the 2003 tax cut, which was, well, I'll talk more about that, but it's a quite unique phenomenon. Of course, that was rushed through in the immediate aftermath of what appeared to be a victory in Iraq. And next thing, we have a tax cut. And then a few months later, oh, by the way, there's this little bill we forgot to tell you about, which has done a lot to change the debate in the last few weeks. So I saw all of that going on and realized back in the discussions over the tax cut that we had a new style of government, that the people running the country were not the same. We're not playing by the rules we had been accustomed to in politicians, which left me sensitized to the possibility that something similar might be happening on foreign policy. And I guess you all know the story. Even if you think that the Iraq War was a justified venture, it wasn't justified by the reasons that were given. It was sold on constantly shifting pretenses. There's a link to Al-Qaeda. Well, no. Okay, well, they're developing nuclear weapons. Well, no. Well, it's all about democracy in the Middle East and humanitarian concerns. And so constantly shifting rationale, which is, again, a clear signal that the underlying agenda is quite different from the expressed agenda. As in the case of the tax cut, there was a lot of just plain, dishonesty. You just have to look, and it was not, by the way, hard to identify. What was amazing to me during the run-up to the Iraq War, as it was during the selling of the tax cut, was how much of what has later turned out, that what has now been presented as revelations after the fact, was actually in the public domain, if you were looking for it in advance. Not as clearly. I mean, it didn't take. All it took was a little bit of research to discover that the numbers used to justify the tax cut were all wrong. It took a little bit of reading of the foreign press or of reading some of the less publicized news sources to have the sense that we were being sold something that wasn't, that intelligence was being oversold in the advance of the Iraq War. But it wasn't quite as easy. But if you had seen it happen on tax cuts, you sort of had a suspicion that this might be happening. I think a lot of what went on during the certainly on the war debate was the feeling that, oh, but yes, maybe they do that when it comes to taxes, but they wouldn't do that on foreign policy, they wouldn't do that on matters of life and death. But it's turned out that style of governing tends to spill over across different areas. And of course, bait and switch. We were told this was going to be quick and we'd be out, and our departing troops would be greeted with flowers as the new well-established government in Iraq cheered us on. Now we're told we're in there for the duration. So it's again the same sort of thing. Just a bit. One of the most one of the most controversial things I say in the book, with the new material, it's not in the columns, is to talk about what all this says about what's going on in the United States. And I think that you cannot make sense of this without, of what's going on without realizing that we are actually dealing with a group of people who have a very radical agenda. It's in a way, it's a shame that we call this, that the term conservative has come to mean people who advocate shifting policies to the right, because often that doesn't mean conservative. That actually means a radical uprooting of the way things are right now. And that it's the ruling coalition in the United States includes people who want to roll back the welfare state, roll back social insurance programs. The tax cuts only make sense. The persistence in tax cuts only makes sense in the form of an agenda that's designed to starve the government of the revenue needed to maintain those programs. And I wrote about that in the New York Times Magazine a week ago Sunday, that clearly the Iraq War needs to be seen in the context of a desire to completely change the way we do foreign policy. If you like, the tax cuts were about undoing the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. The war in Iraq was about undoing the legacy of Harry Truman. We're moving to this unilateralist, militarized foreign policy, and that's a really radical change. None of this, quote you my publishers hate this, but I actually have been giving plugs to other books in the angry liberal movement of this fall that they don't publish. But Molly Ivins, who does have another very different in style book, one of my favorite quotes from Molly Ivins, she said that the thing I really hate about the Bushies is the way they make me feel like a paranoid conspiracy theorist all the time. And the trouble is that to talk about hidden agendas or underlying agendas always sounds like that, but in fact most of it's quite out in the open. So that if you say, well, these people really want to undermine the tax basis for Social Security and Medicare, the reaction is, well, you're a crazy conspiracy theorist. But that goal is quite open on the part of the Heritage Foundation, which is the intellectual headquarters for today's Republican Party. It's quite open on the part of Grover Norquist, who's not just an influential lobbyist, but actually meets every week with Republican members of Congress to vet appointments. So it's really the people who have these agendas are not hidden. On the war in Iraq, it's quite out in the open that a group of people, Cheney, of course, Wolfowitz, Pearl, have been agitating for that war ever since 1991. The program for a new American century is not a myth. They have a website, and it's all right there. So the truth is there are underlying agendas, and it's turned out, alas, that the war in Iraq followed the same pattern. That we had an underlying agenda which was used to push something that was not, at least in conventional terms, not thought through. We were assured over and over again that the tax cuts were affordable, that they would not compromise the government's ability to make provision for the future and to pay for essential programs. It did. We were assured over and over again that the Iraq War was going to be just what we needed to stabilize the Middle East and enhance our role in the world, and it's turned out to be a lot more fraught and problematic than that. Okay, what about the war and the economy, using the different meaning of and? Okay, in a direct sense, the war, of course, it was whatever it was, $79 billion in the first installment, another $87 billion in this installment. It's unclear how much we've seen of the costs. On one side, that $87 billion apparently includes the assumption that our allies are going to come up with several tens of billions of dollars in aid. And when we say our allies, obviously Uzbekistan is not going to come up with that money. We really are talking about the French and the Germans, who, since we've treated them so politely, will be happy to oblige. It's a lot of money. It's unlikely to be forthcoming. Among other things, if you look at it, it turns out that what the United States was hoping to get from Europe would essentially be about as much as the total amount of foreign aid that Europe gives to the rest of the world. This is just not going to happen. So on the one hand, there are large hidden charges. We haven't seen the last of it. On the other hand, there's some pretty amazing story in today's Washington Post. I just happened to see it, which said that Republican leaders in Congress have, off the record, said that things might not be so bad because they think that the numbers are padded to include extra costs and also money to be used for other covert military operations. This is supposed to make us feel better about the budgeting. All right, it's a lot of money. Now, in the scale of things, you might say it's not that big, considering all the other stuff that's going on. It's still true that even with the $87 billion, if you look for the sources, we're looking at a budget deficit of probably $550 billion for the coming fiscal year, give or take 100. No, give or take 50. It's not going to be under 500. It might be 600. Of that, Iraq-related expenditures will be probably not even $87 billion because some of that won't be actually spent. So you could say, well, that's not there are a lot of other things going on in the budget deficit. Close to $300 billion would be the result of the tax cuts since 2000. So even now, all this military stuff is dwarfed as an expense by tax cuts. But it is taking a very nasty budget situation and making it substantially nastier. So that's a major concern. It is also it's also reinforcing some disturbing tendencies in the way our budget operates. I haven't yet written about this in the Times, and I will shortly. There is something very funny going on with contracting. Do we need to say that? This comes back to the issue I've spoken about the erasing of the distinction between the lobbyists and the government. It's not just the case that companies that make big campaign contributions seem to have a leg up. We seem to have companies where actual members of the government have or recently had a large financial stake themselves are getting a lot of profits at the expense of the government. For what it's worth, again, the Congressional Research Service has just issued a report saying that by the normal criteria that it applies, Dick Cheney still does have a financial stake in Halliburton. He may have explanations about why it wouldn't influence his decisions, but by the criteria normally applied to federal officials, it still counts as a financial stake. I don't think that's terribly central. I think the point is that when you have the company that made the vice president rich getting $1.2 billion and counting of no-bid contracts, you have to have a funny feeling about what's going on. There are many more. There's a lot of subcontracting within all of this to defense-related firms, many of which are headed by former military officers. You have to wonder about the issue of moral hazard in the military itself. The last point on the costs of Iraq is that the direct costs may not tell the full story. And I've written about this a little bit. This is one of these things where I have to stretch. I'm having to bone up on things that I didn't know anything about. But it's clear to everybody who does know something about this that we don't have a big enough army for this stuff. That as it now stands, we have of the Army's 33 combat brigades, the rule is on a sustained basis, only 1 in 3 should be deployed abroad. Otherwise, readiness deteriorates steadily. It really does damage to the quality of the Army. In fact, we've got 16 of those 33 in Iraq, another 2 in Afghanistan, and several others elsewhere, so that we have something where we're badly overstressing the military. And if you say this is something we have to do, then we need a bigger military. And at that point, we're really talking about lots and lots of money. So it's a big thing. What does the Iraq venture do to the economy in the short run? It's probably mildly expansionary. You're spending a lot of money. One of the things that we've seen in terms of economic policy, we've kind of had a test here. There was a question. Some probably standard textbook economics would say that standard textbook economics says that in the short term, when you have a depressed economy, budget deficits are actually a good thing. They pump money into the economy and they support it. But standard textbook economics would also say that it probably depends on what kind of budget deficit you run. So if you have the government directly spending money, hopefully building useful things, but maybe not. Certainly, if the government directly spends money, then that certainly stimulates the economy. If the government puts money in the hands of people who are likely to spend it, that's the next best thing. If it puts money into the wallets of people whose wallets are already bulging, they're that much less likely to spend it, and maybe that's not very effective. We've had, and some people would say, oh, that's not true, and there are technical arguments and then emotional arguments, but we've had kind of a test case. And we have a budget deficit of $500 billion or so, which is equivalent to the wages of 10 million average workers. And if you think that we've actually created 10 million jobs with this deficit, you haven't been out much lately. So it's not, we seem to have a test case. The military spending happens to be, well, it's direct spending. So it's probably slightly stimulative. There is the question about oil prices, and God knows. One of my if this thing really were to drive oil prices down a lot, that's obviously a short-term benefit. If the worst happens and somehow it leads to oil prices rising a lot, a danger which has receded but not gone away, then it's a very bad thing. But the economic impact is actually probably secondary. The short-term economic impact, the budget impact is potentially very, very large indeed. Where does all this leave us? Mostly it leaves us very close to the question and answers. But I think the point to make is that the whole Iraq story, I think, should be put in the context of something gone very awry with the system, with the way we govern ourselves. That we've had policies that were, whatever else you can say, not responsible, not honestly sold, and not thought out. And here we go with another one, which is a very, very big issue. The interesting thing about what's happening in the Iraq War is that it appears that last $87 billion has finally caught the public's attention. I've been writing, and some other people have been writing for a couple of years about bait and switch and irresponsibility and dishonest salesmanship, and it just kind of rolled off, partly because, well, we may talk in the Q&A about why that is, but it just didn't get much traction. And something about this, first we have the aircraft carrier landing, then we have the bill, seems to have caught the public's attention. There's been a very, both just by listening to the tone of public discussion and, of course, by reading the polls, you can see that people have finally become alerted to the fact that there's something happening here, and it isn't very appetizing. What happens next? I have no idea. But we are clearly at a moment of some kind of crisis over how the United States is governed. The Iraq War has brought it to a head, though I think we would have gotten there eventually anyway. And it's going to be exciting, interesting, and very unpleasant times in the couple of years ahead. Thank you.